presented as an addition in relation to the 2008 base. So the coin has been changed. And again, unless one had been familiar with all the details that was produced last year, one wouldn't have particularly known this. So, buried and misrepresented, and what we have to do is to flush them out. And not just for West Coast Main Line, but obviously for East Coast Main Line and Midland Main Line in terms of the Y, but for West Coast Main Line only in terms of Phase 1. Secondly, the concerns with the alternatives are about disruption. The West Coast Main Line upgrade actually causes less disruption than HS2. And also, crucially, any upgrade of the West Coast Main Line this time is not like the last one, which Philip Hammond has made much of, and he's talked about how we couldn't possibly have an upgrade like last time because of the enormous disruption it caused to passengers. The reason it's different is because this time it's about curing pinch points on the line, 7 pinch points on the West Coast Main Line, rather than redoing all the track and signalling, which was what the West Coast Main Line upgrade was about last time. And the second thing it's doing is it's getting a lot of its capacity benefits just by lengthening the trains and having more trains, and that isn't disruptive. There is considerable concern about what HS2 is going to do to existing services. And existing services will suffer. First of all, there's disruption, obviously, during the construction of HS2. And buried in the detail, and also looking at things to do with West Coast Main Line, the new development of West Coast Main Line in terms of franchising it, Euston is going to have 7 years' worth of disruption. It's like building another station alongside Euston, which is going to affect the services as well as passengers. Secondly, the Great Western Main Line services will be disrupted, and as will Chiltern. There will be delays to increasing capacity. There is a particular problem in terms of the commuting service, the overcrowding of the Northampton, Milton Keynes, Euston service. That problem is going to stay there, and it's going to have to wait to 2026. It needn't, but it is if we go forward with HS2. Secondly, the East Coast Main Line and any developments on Midland Main Line are going to have to wait until the Y is done, which is even longer, 2032, 2033. And then what will the impact of HS2 itself be? Well, there will be some winners. Birmingham, Leeds and Manchester, and also the Parkway stations, although there will be some loss at the Parkway stations because they will have to access them from the town centres. Far more, however, there will be a lot of losers. The train services are going to suffer because there will be lower demand. So naturally, the services on classic rail, as it's called, would be trimmed. And some major stations are going to get slower and fewer services. For example, in Phase 1, Coventry, Wolverhampton, Stoke. In Phase 2, Leicester, Chesterfield, Peterborough, Doncaster. There will also be the towns who are served by interchange stations who are going to be worse off, because either they have on their classic services, they will suffer and they will be less frequent and be slower, or they will have to travel to the interchange point. And then the Great Western Main Line services will all make an extra stop, and so there will be an effect on journey time. I put at the bottom there, beware of uncashable promises of more classic services. One might expect that the DfT and HS2 Limited will say, well, we can do more classic services. However, what they won't be saying is that they will come with a cost, because they can only happen They can only be justified if somebody else is going to pay, and therefore there will have to be additional subsidy if you're going to make good those losses. Much has been said about the north-south divide, and there are different aspects to it. Two key points. The first one is that there are the direct economic impacts of making an HS2 investment, and these are quantified. The second ones are ones we hear a lot about from Philip Hammond, which are the regenerative benefits. And this is where HS2 acts as a catalyst, and these are much more the qualitative ones. So let's have a look first of all at the quantitative ones, the direct economic impacts. First of all, we actually have the productivity benefits. But of course, we've already talked about those because they are in the business case. So that is the fundamental productivity benefits which are said to be there from getting places faster. Then we have the wider economic impacts. And these we recall at the beginning of the presentation when we talked about and we saw that there was a £4 billion benefit for phase 1 and a little bit more than that for phase 2, a £6.3 billion benefit for the Y. Now they are made up of 2 points. The first one is what are called agglomeration benefits. And I think the way to think of those is they are the freed up capacity that you get for local services. But there's a big if. They have to again be funded. They don't come automatically. They don't come for free. Secondly, there's some imperfect competition, which are savings from faster connectivity. Most of the benefit is from the agglomeration benefit. What HS2 Limited did then is they asked Imperial College, well, are there any further benefits? Are there any additional benefits that come from this faster connectivity? And some work was done by Imperial, by Daniel Graham, and the conclusion from that was, in fact, almost nothing. It was at maximum 8 to 10 million pounds per annum. So, on the direct economic impacts, this is why we often hear talked about these wider economic impacts, this 4 billion and 6 billion, because as you can see, that is the predominant figure that comes out from there, in addition to what we've already counted for in the business case. Now, the regenerative benefits. This is where HS2 is acting as a catalyst. So the key one there is you will get property developments by stations, so shopping centres, for example. And the figures in the new business case on that tell us that there's going to be 30,000 more jobs. What it doesn't say is that most probably there will not be new jobs, because the academics in this area would say they're not new jobs, they are simply moving from elsewhere. But what the business case does tell us is that 7 out of 10 of these 30,000 jobs are going to be in London. And it goes on to say that Old Oak Common is the best regeneration location. Now that to us doesn't seem very consistent with saying that it's going to benefit the north-south divide, because the benefits look like being predominantly in the London area and the south. But in addition to the property developments by stations, there is this thing called the transformational benefits that we also hear a lot about. And this, in effect, is economic growth. Is there going to be some additional economic growth? Now, this might come in 3 sorts of ways. It might be relocation from London to the Midlands and the regions. But actually, given that 70% of the travellers on HS2 are leisure travellers, and given that more people are going to be travelling to London and back, so they are visiting London rather than the reverse, it's most likely that the money will be spent in London rather than in the regions. Secondly, transfers within region. Yes, there will be transfers within regions, but it's no net gain to the region itself. It's just moving about within the region. Finally, yes, there might be transformational benefits in terms of new business startup, but actually no evidence is provided for that. So in terms of unpacking the north-south divide, if anything, we're given evidence for the opposite. We're given evidence that it might be London that benefits rather than the Midlands. So this has now raised, we would think, some important issues about whether these materials are actually fit for use. An important point about the why: there is almost no information about the why. Now, but even before that, the why itself doesn't even work. There simply aren't enough train paths to make it work. There are 18 each way and none left for HS2 or Heathrow. And secondly, there isn't enough capacity on the classic compatible bit of the railway to take this extra growth that we're being told is going to happen. There isn't enough to get it to Newcastle, for example. But in terms of not enough information on the why, it's serious, because the second consultation question, which is the key one on value for money, isn't asking us about value for money for phase 1 to the West Midlands. It's asking us about value for money for the why. And given there is almost no information given to us about the why in terms of data, that must raise serious questions in terms of asking and answering that consultation question. There is therefore a substantial FOI task. And further, there are actually inconsistencies between some of the data we're presented now with and key pieces of data between now and last year. And finally, whether those materials are fit for use, there is obviously issues to the extent to which they are misleading us and misinforming us on the alternatives, the fact they were hidden, the fact they are bundled, and the fact that it misrepresents the capacity it produces, and on sensitivities, the fact that to do sensitivities properly, there must be sensitivities done on the demand forecast, and yet they ignore the key factor of the forecasting growth factors. And the new research done for DFT that shows the forecasting factors are not the correct ones that have been used. Finally, I said I'd mention just something on other aspects. Carbon emissions. Well, it is still claimed that it's carbon neutral. But there are issues over the air assumptions. For example, will the freed up slots, the freed up domestic flight slots, just be used for long haul? And interestingly, why are the emissions the same despite the fact we have less modal switch? We know from air, previously it was 11,000 a day, and now it's just 8,000 a day. And yet, they are using the same emissions. That doesn't look right. There are still issues over the electricity generation assumptions and also the car emission ones. And cars certainly look to have potential to be greener, faster than rail. And so it's difficult actually to see that one is going to have any modal shift from cars, that there will be any benefit by 2043. Finally, I'd like to mention a word about compensation. There was to be compensation for loss in property value. And indeed, we expected proposals on it. We expected detailed proposals and to be consulted on as to what sort of compensation there would be. Indeed, Hammond made several promises about it. But actually, we are not going to be consulted on a detailed scheme until next year, until 2012. Instead, we've been given 3 options to comment on: a hardship scheme, a property bond scheme,